Now,
Yes.
dear colleagues, friends, students, and researchers, uh, good afternoon. We welcome you today to the address to be delivered by Professor David Walker. He's going to deliver this address on emptiness and invasion in Australian nation building. Professor Walker is a distinguished cultural historian, author, and editor. Currently, he is a holder of honorary professorships at the University of Melbourne, Western Sydney University, and Deakin University. From 2013 to 16, he was the first BHP Chair of Australian Studies at Peking University, and for years before, the Alfred Deakin Professor of Australian Studies at Deakin University. He has opened doors to studying elusive connections, the craft of memory, and forgettings consigned to the past, and yes, Australia's Asia, moving Asia into the mainstream of Australian historical writing. The lecture has been conceived as the second to a series on France effects, to which this department presently tends, and belongs to the set of colloquium lectures hosted now for several years. It explores this lecture, the transnation nested within the nationing project, taking Australia and its unease with Asia as a case study. I would now request Professor Debnaran Bandopadhyay. Unfortunately, he said he would be here, but there's a meeting going on, I think. So Professor Debnaran Bandopadhyay wanted to be here, but he cannot be.
Sure.
Now, how do I introduce Professor Walker? As an explorer, scholar, thinker of forbidding range, traveler, and my teacher, who has authored and edited seminal books, whose writings brim with humor and sparkle, even as they sometimes operate in a Beowulf frame of loss, death, and violence. His titles, Anxious Nation and Stranded Nation, written decades apart, explore and reimagine Australia's forgotten Asias from 1850s till the 1970s, gathering illusions and voicing silences from a forbidding range of resources that belong to literature, history, cultural studies, politics, and economics. As macular degeneration blurred faces and books, the Australian historian who had always resisted family histories turned to this long-avoided genre. Not Dark Yet, his 2012 publication, delves into personal history. When I became legally blind, David Walker writes, I had to rethink the kind of history I was able to write. I had to find another, more personal voice and another way of writing. The mix of the historical and the personal seemed promising. Yet Australian responses to a looming Asia forms and frames the book, and Not Dark Yet could be read as national history from a fresh perspective, that of family documents, photographs, and remembered quirks, comic elegy, and looking glass. His upcoming title, Happy Together, Bridging the Australia-China Divide, to be published from Melbourne University Publishing, attempts that fresh perspective through the lens of memoir, culture, and friendship wrought in acts of translation. A pioneering thinker on nation and its translations in the context of Australia, Professor David Walker's Anxious Nation had inspired the theme of my PhD research. I keep unlearning and learning from him as he sparked off ideas in his emails, still laughs at me, and has even been my guide through the streets and mysteries of Kolkata when he first visited, a reversal of roles initially intended. He taught me not to despair. We recommend to our students your book, The Story of Australia, A New History of People and Places, David, and that cutting-edge anthology, Australia's Asia, on an emptied indispensability of Australian history writing and its cross-cultural encounters. I am very, very happy, David, that we have you among us today for the address on emptiness and invasion in Australian nation building. And I say a warm hello to Karen too, of course, and a feeling of eternal gratitude, the term you highly mocked in your book, not dark yet. You have kindled and sustained my Australian studies visions, and may some of our students catch that kindle here today. Thank you, David. We are now waiting to hear you.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, Ipshita. And if you are one of my students, and I very gladly claim you, you are certainly one of the best. And can I tell your students that they are very lucky to have you as a teacher. And it's always been a pleasure to meet you, to talk to you, and to exchange emails with you. Some of your emails, I think, should be published. They're very fine documents. Very fine documents. So today, this is an informal talk, and Ipshita will keep me on time, so you can tell me how much longer I have to talk when we're about 5 minutes away from the end, Ipshita, and I will remarkably come to an end.
Oh, come on, David, please. There's no such time as such.
Oh, really?
Please carry on.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I have to fly to Sydney on Friday, so there is a deadline. So emptiness, I've chosen emptiness and invasion as two words around which I will build my talk. The first meaning of emptiness, or one of the first meanings of emptiness, related to the British colonising project in Australia. And I know that some of you have not done Australian history, so I'll give you some of the dates and some of the background. But in 1788, the British colonisation of Australia began. And it began in a continent in which there were, of course, Aboriginal people. And we now know from recent dating techniques that the Aboriginal settlement of Australia... Oh, we've lost a picture?
Yes.
Shall I continue?
Yes, please do.
Okay. The Aboriginal settlement of Australia goes back at least 65,000 years. This was not known at the time of European settlement. There was no such understanding of how long Aboriginal people had lived in the Australian continent. But the first understanding of this continent was that it was terra nullius, terra, T-E-R-R-A, terra meaning land. This is Latin, terra nullius, nullius, N-U-L-L-I-U-S, terra nullius, empty land. So the notion of Australia as a continent, when the British came here, or they declared that the continent of Australia was empty. In other words, so terra nullius was the legal term that the colonisers decided to use to justify their colonisation of Australia, their argument being that this was an empty continent available for the British colonial project. And it was only as recently as 30 years ago that the legal concept of terra nullius was challenged in the High Court of Australia by an Aboriginal or a Torres Strait Islander person called Eddie Mabo, and he challenged the idea that Australia was an empty continent. And it was not until then, as I say, 30 years ago, we marked the 30th anniversary of that challenge to the High Court this year. Yes, we got to the High Court of Australia.
Yes.
And the very famous Mabo decision, Mabo, M-A-B-O, Eddie Mabo. And Eddie Mabo took a case to the High Court, and he argued that Australia was not terra nullius, was not an empty land. And that decision was a remarkably important one in Australian history because it recognised in law that Australia was an inhabited continent, which of course everyone knew, but the law behaves strangely. So the law of the land had to change to recognise that Australia had been an inhabited continent, inhabited by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So that was a remarkable turning point in Australian history, and thereafter a number of Aboriginal land right claims have been lodged. So Aboriginal people can now claim title to land that they can demonstrate was occupied by their ancestors. And there have been a number of land claims settled over the last 30 years. But that again, so that's the first understanding of this idea of emptiness that I wanted to introduce you to. The second notion of emptiness relates more to the ways in which Australia, after a century of settlement, remembering that the British came in 1788, their centenary of settlement was 1888, and at that stage, less than 4 million settlers had entered Australia. So by 1888, there was a growing concern that after a full century of settlement, the number of people who had entered Australia was still relatively small. Now, when Australians, when people settling in Australia looked at the size of their continent, they made calculations about what kind of population that continent should be able to hold. So Australia, the land mass of Australia, is roughly that of the United States. It's a little bit less than that of the United States. But the feeling was that Australia should also have a population roughly equivalent to that of the United States. Now, today, the United States has a population of, 330 million? Australia has a population of 25 to 26 million. So clearly, Australia does not have a population equivalent to the United States. But in the late 19th century, there was a feeling. We okay? How are we going?
We are absolutely fine.
Okay, good. I will continue.
Yes, of course.
For Australians in 1888, as they looked around their continent with its population of only 4 million people, they thought of it as being virtually an empty continent. They didn't think about Aboriginal Australians as being inhabitants of the continent. And they also understood that if they were to have a population that was appropriate for the size of the continent, then it would need a population of much greater than 4 million. And a lot of the projections, a lot of the forecasts at this time were for Australia to have a population in excess of 100 million people. Now, I know for India, that hardly seems like anything at all, but for Australia, that was a significant population projection. So the idea was you should have over 100 million, 1888, less than 4 million. So again, in a lot of the writing and the thinking about Australia in the late 19th century, this notion of it being an empty continent started to creep into the discussion. Now, the notion of emptiness was also intensified, or the understanding of Australia's emptiness was intensified by a growing awareness that Australia was situated in the Asia-Pacific world, or the Pacific, it was more often called in the 19th century. So Australians before that had had an uneasy sense that they were a long way away from Britain, a long way away from Britain. And they had a kind of ancestral connection back to Britain. And they had a very uneven, a very unreliable understanding of the region around them. They didn't understand the countries to their north. But increasingly from the 1880s, that idea began to change. And it began to change partly because Australians began to notice that China was just to Australia's north. A number of Chinese had come into Australia in the gold fields for seeking gold in the 1850s. So there was a growing consciousness of a Chinese presence in Australia and a growing understanding of geopolitical China, that there was a big country called China and it was to Australia's north. So when Australia had a population of 4 million and they looked north to China, China had a population then, around 1900, of 400 million. So Australians became increasingly and uneasily conscious of the fact that there were very few of them, and very few of them in comparison, particularly to China. So the notion of emptiness was intensified by Australia's growing understanding that it was located, it was a British settlement, essentially a British settlement located in the Asia-Pacific world, located in the Pacific. So that sort of deepened an unease, or as I pointed out in the book that Professor Sengupta cited at the beginning of her introduction, a book called Anxious Nation, Australians became anxious about their location in the region, anxious about the fact that they were an Anglo-Celtic community a long, long way from home. Now, the other understandings of emptiness, I think, are quite interesting and worth exploring as well in this context, because clearly I've been talking about emptiness or referring to emptiness in essentially population terms. Australia had a small population. Asia, particularly China, had a very large population. Are we still in business here, Ipshita?
Oh, yes. And I don't think there will be many more mishaps. Somehow,
Really?
yes, I don't think right now. I mean,
we've done the mishaps.
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, very good. Okay, so the first understanding of emptiness that I'm referring to here is really quite a literal population-based idea that the Australian continent, with 4 million people, had too few settlers, and when compared to China, to Australia's north, with 400 million, that looked empty. But there are other meanings to the term empty, which I wanted to point to in this discussion, because emptiness can also refer to both a spiritual and an existential state of being. It's a way of thinking about your place in the world. So the emptiness of settler Australia also referred to an unease about the ways in which these settlers fitted into the continent that they had come to settle in, the ways in which they either understood or misunderstood that continent. So there's a deeper psychological set of meanings which I think attach to this anxiety about Australian emptiness in the late 19th century. And that points to something. Now, I'm doing mishaps at this end. That's the telephone ringing in the background, which I will ignore in the hope that Karen will pick up the phone. So the psychological dimensions of emptiness, I think, are worth addressing and thinking about in this context as well, because these settlers had travelled across the world. They come from Britain, which had a settled culture, a settled class system, a significant literature and culture, and they transplanted themselves into what was routinely referred to as the New World. But in that New World, all the old meanings had been turned upside down. All the class associations had been turned upside down. The ways in which people related to each other were different in the new continent of Australia. And so that sense of being dislocated or dislodged, removed, cut off from your home culture conveyed, I believe, a sense of unease about the meaning of your existence, the meaning of your settlement, and the purpose of your settlement. What was the purpose of Australian settlement? What were these settlers doing here? And were they properly equipped to manage the process of settlement? Were they up to the task of settlement, which by the late 19th century had become a serious mission, if you like, a serious project to develop a new society, create a new culture, and to actually stand for something. So sitting below the literal meaning of emptiness as a fairly obvious set of statements around population, sit these other meanings about an unease about being in Australia, unease about the purpose of settlement, and an unease about the nature of the new continent which they inhabited, which was also so very different in so many ways from Britain, where Britain was a relatively confined island with relatively dense populations. Australia was enormously spread out. There were huge distances in Australia. The landscape was unfamiliar. The seasons were unfamiliar. So everything about Australia was unfamiliar and disconcerting, and its meanings were particularly elusive. So emptiness, I think, is an interesting pointer, a valuable pointer to some of the perplexities of Australian settlement in the late 19th and early 20th century. Now, the other point I want to make in this immediate context is that down to the 1st of January 1901, we are talking about a continent that was divided into 6 colonies: New South Wales, Victoria, and so on. I'm sitting in Victoria, in Melbourne, which I might point out is extremely cold and wet today. So I'm here in Melbourne. So we had New South Wales, South Australia, Victoria, Queensland, Western Australia, Tasmania, etc. as colonies. Each of those colonies reported back to the Colonial Office in London. So through 19th century Australia, there was no such thing as the nation. There was no such thing as adding to the unease or the existential uncertainty about what Australia was this notion that it didn't exist as a nation through the 19th century. So each of those colonies reported back directly to the Colonial Office in London. They were administered from the Colonial Office. So there was very little sense of cohesive nationhood in Australia through the 19th century. And that only changed and began to change on the 1st of January 1901, when the Australian colonies federated and Australia became the Commonwealth of Australia. So it became technically and legally and constitutionally a nation on the 1st of January 1901, with a national parliament, firstly in Melbourne, later in Canberra, and all the apparatus of government, including a high court system, defence system, and so on. So it's not until 1st of January 1901 that former colonies became states. So I now live not in the colony of Victoria, which disappeared on the 1st of January 1901. I live in the state of Victoria in 2022. So added to that set of uncertainties about what it was to be Australian that I've spoken about earlier was, if you like, the constitutional and legal uncertainty about what Australia was, what it added up to as a nation. So it didn't exist as a nation until 1901. So we have the various states of existential unease, uncertainty that I've spoken about, added to which we have the uncertainty about the nature and status of the Australian nation. So this nation, created on the 1st of January 1901, was the first new nation of the 20th century. Australia was the first new nation of the 20th century. It achieved nationhood at a time when it was becoming increasingly aware of how distant it was from Britain. So Britain being the source of Australian security, of defence. Britain was the major investor in Australia, so Australia's economic security depended on Britain. Australia's cultural security depended on Britain, of borrowed institutions, legal institutions, educational institutions, religious practices and institutions, and so on. All of that was derived from Britain. So Australia was a deeply derivative society in so many ways. And that, again, I think, added to the sense of uncertainty about its stability, about its status, about its standing, and about its hold on the continent. Now, this happened. These uncertainties were becoming more intense at the same time that the world to Australia's north was becoming more unsettled and more assertive. China was showing both a great capacity for disruption through the late 19th century, but also a growing awareness of its geopolitical standing. And Japan, which Australia had barely noticed before the 1890s, Japan, which Australia had barely noticed before the 1890s, was beginning to assert itself in Australia's region as well. And in 1894-95, Japan defeated Russia in the Sino-Japanese War of that period. So Japan suddenly presented itself in the 1890s as a major military and naval power to Australia's north. So all of these geopolitical developments came at a time when Australia was finding its feet as a new nation, aware of its vulnerable place in the Asia-Pacific region. So the geopolitical world that Australia faced was also changing quite dramatically. And Japan's rise and the defeat of China in the middle of the 1890s put Japan very much on the map. And as I'm sure you would know, Japan in the late 19th century was a miracle of modernization. The Meiji Restoration in 1868 had turned Japan really from a fairly isolated feudal nation into a nation determined to modernize. And across pretty much a generation, over 30 years, Japan had roamed the world looking for best practice in all sorts of areas, in administration, in naval capacity, in military capacity, in military training. The Japanese had gone to the British for naval expertise. They'd gone to Prussia for military expertise. So the Japanese had shown themselves to be tremendous borrowers of best practice from around the world. So from a nation that in the 1850s, 60s and 70s was barely noticed in Australia, hardly anyone, if you're reading the newspapers of the period, hardly anyone mentioned Japan. By the 1890s, Japan had really overtaken China as the big story of the Asian world in the late 19th century, and a nation with considerable military power and military prowess, and a nation in Australia's region. So the idea of Australia as an insecure nation, for the reasons which I've pointed out, insecure in terms of its small population, insecure according to the existential, cultural, psychological meanings that I've attached to the word emptiness, but now insecure in a geopolitical sense, all come together at the time that the Australian nation is formed. And I think that is a really significant conjunction of events. So the nation of Australia comes into being at exactly the time that it starts to fear that its own future was seriously threatened by rising tensions and more forceful policies emerging from the nations of East Asia in particular. So Australia had only just appeared as a nation when it began to worry about its ultimate disappearance as a nation. So appearance and disappearance kind of sit together in the formation of the Australian nation in the late 19th and early 20th century. And I think,
David,
again, yes?
What did you mean by disappearance? The appearance and disappearance of the nation, you said?
Yes, I did. I did say that. Well, I will come to that. Let me then move towards the idea of invasion.
Okay.
So keep appearance and disappearance in mind. The nation has just appeared, 1st of January 1901. So it makes a formal constitutional appearance at that time. But again, in the 1880s, in 1888, in fact, in the centenary year of settlement, the first invasion story of Australia is published in a labour movement publication called The Boomerang. The Boomerang. I'm sure you've all heard of the boomerang. The boomerang is the Aboriginal weapon. And the story was called, and please forgive the language, this is the late 19th century speaking. It is not Professor David Walker, distinguished scholar in Melbourne. The late 19th century title was White or Yellow, a story of the race war of AD 1908. So the first invasion story, the first story that, going back to the question that Ipshita asked, the story of the disappearance of Australia, the story of invasion, appeared in 1888. And the plot of the story is that the Chinese, working in collaboration with British elites, were going to take hold of the colony of Queensland, and that they were going to rule it for their own advantage. They were going to create a mixed race population in Queensland. So in effect, Queensland and longer term other colonies would be subservient to British and Chinese imperial and commercial interests. So Australia would not exist as an independent nation, or Queensland would not exist as an independent colony. So the idea of Australia being vulnerable to invasion enters, I think, the national psyche, if you like, in the late 1880s. So in a sense, the Chinese who'd appeared on the goldfields in the 1850s and the 1860s, they appeared as individuals, but geopolitical Asia dawns upon Australia in the 1880s. And geopolitical Asia is the thing that threatens Australia's disappearance, on the grounds that here was a big empty continent. There are only 4 million people in it. What were they doing there? Did they have an entitlement to this continent? And would not the crowded nations to Australia's north be better placed to both take over the continent and to develop it? So the idea emerges that Australia is a kind of illegitimate settlement. It hasn't established its raison d'etre. It hasn't established its reason to exist. Whereas the nations to Australia's north, as I say, crowded, often very poor, demanding space, why were they excluded? Why should 4 million white Australians feel entitled to exclude the nations to Australia's north? So a kind of crisis of legitimacy, if you like, begins to build up around the project of Australian settlement, which was also a project of white settlement. So you're still hearing me?
Yes, I can. We can.
Very good.
Yes.
Very good. So from the 1880s, a number of stories begin to appear which have an invasion theme to them. One that I'm particularly fond of was called The Coloured Conquest. The Coloured Conquest, published 1903. And in The Coloured Conquest, it's Japan, after its victory over China, it's Japan that is the nation that invades Australia and takes over the continent. So that goes to the question that Ipshita asked about appearance and disappearance. The continent appears formally and constitutionally on the 1st of January 1901, but there's this growing speculation that it lives in a highly contested part of the world. And the notion develops that Australia is a kind of prize, that Australia is an empty continent available for the settlement of other nations, that is, the 4 million Australians, white Australians who inhabited the continent, could readily be pushed aside by a more determined adversary from Australia's north. You're still in business?
Yes, we are.
Still in business.
Yes, we are. We are. Yes, I don't Yes, we are in business.
Very good. That's excellent. That's excellent. So now, of course, you might ask where India sits in this picture. And through the 19th century, in a lot of the speculation, India is regarded as Alfred Deakin, one of Australia's first prime ministers, described it as the antique Orient. So, and Ipshita has written brilliantly about Alfred Deakin. So I won't say anything about Alfred Deakin because she knows much more.
Oh, come on, David, you must
She knows much more on this subject. She knows much more on this subject than I do. But so Alfred Deakin's idea of the antique Orient was of an India that was steeped in history, that was the source of great religions and great philosophies, but which had past its use-by date, to use a dreadful colloquialism, and that so India was all past. India was in the past, and in any event, it was the British who ran India according to the predominant modes of Australian thinking in the late 19th century. So when it came to reckoning the threats, the geopolitical threats to Australia, India did not feature very prominently. It featured as a colour threat, as a threat to whiteness, but not as a military threat. And the same sort of argument can be used about the Netherlands East Indies, now Indonesia. Why was Indonesia not considered a threat in the way that China and Japan were figured as threats? Well, the basic argument here again is that the Dutch were in control of the Netherlands East Indies, that they were the people who were running the country. The Netherlands East Indies was also, in a sense, an antique culture from the Western point of view and posed no modern threat. So in a sense, the emergence of Japan in the 1890s captured many of the nightmares of Australian colonial settlement, that it was an Oriental power, an Asian power, but it was also a modern power. It was a modern power that had learnt the military capacities of the West, military and naval capacities of the West, drawing upon German and British precedents. So Japan became modernized, threatening Asia, organized, disciplined, cohesive, and potentially very powerful. So The Coloured Conquest, published 1903, is a novel which shifts the concern about invasion from China, from populist China, to Japan, to disciplined, modern Japan. And one of the themes running through the story, and I think it's a very interesting one, is that it's a story that discusses the ways in which Australian settlement would develop. The argument being that that British Australia had replaced Aboriginal Australia. So that Aboriginal Australia had been pushed aside by British settlement. But the argument of the Coloured Conquest was that British settlement and white Australia would be pushed aside by invasive Asia. So you had a sequencing of the Australian continent, a colour sequencing, if you like, which I know is one of the themes of your course, so that we go from a period of black history, Aboriginal history, to a brief interregnum, a brief period of white colonisation, which was then replaced by a long-term and, if you like, final Asian settlement of Australia. So again, using late 19th century language, not the language of 2022, just as white replaced black, so too would yellow replace white. So it's a kind of sequencing of settlement, which again goes to that question of the disappearance of a so recently announced new nation almost immediately after its creation as a nation, after its appearance as a nation. Its disappearance is being speculated upon. Now, I also argue in running this argument, I argue that white Australia developed a kind of preemptive pathos about its own disappearance, that the invasion stories kind of present or a plea for sympathy to the wider world at the disappearance of a nation that had barely had an opportunity to establish itself. There was no such concern really about the actual disappearance or the actual displacement and subjection of Aboriginal Australia. So you have a kind of a real displacement of the Aboriginal population that attracts very little concern. But at the same time, you have, as I say, a kind of preemptive pathos about the disappearance of white Australia. I would also argue, and this is an argument that I think is relevant to the times in which we live, and that is that Australia has what in America is now being referred to as the replacement theory. And I'm sure you've encountered this idea that in the it's very hard to keep up with mass shootings in America, but the shootings in Buffalo in the state of New York were perpetrated by a gunman aiming his fire at African Americans. And he was doing so in the belief that African Americans had taken over or were taking over America, by which he meant white America or mainstream settler America. Donald Trump's argument about the big steal is also a kind of replacement theory argument that all sorts of people are now voting in America, African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, who are really not real Americans. They're not real Americans. So real America is being replaced by these ersatz or false or wrong Americas, racially wrong and culturally inappropriate Americas. So Australia often now looks at America and is puzzled by the American attachment to replacement theory. But Australia has its own, particularly I think in the invasion literature, in invasion writing, it has its own history of replacement anxiety, if you like, that white Australia is a fragile creation, culturally, spiritually, militarily, and that it is vulnerable to being taken over by more determined, more hostile powers to its north. So Australians, I believe, have lived in that environment of anxiety about their own continuing existence on the continent, sitting alongside an unease about the appropriateness of their being there at all. And that sense of their appropriateness about being there at all has, I think, again, intensified in different ways more recently as Aboriginal Australia has asserted itself more forcefully. And as we come to understand that Aboriginal Australia has the longest continuous civilization on the planet, 65,000 years plus is the longest continuous civilization on the planet. So the people who know Australia best, who know Australia, have a deep and unique spiritual and cultural attachment to the continent are not white Australians, not settler Australians, but Aboriginal Australians. So the rediscovery, if you like, of Aboriginality and the reassertion of the Aboriginal voice in Australian culture has created this other concern about the depth and legitimacy of Australian settlement. Now, I'm wondering if I should pause there for a moment in the belief that there may be a question. How are we going for time? I'm looking at my watch, but I'm not really seeing it.
David, the 1 hour is over, but we have time. It is up to you. It is absolutely up to you, in the sense I'm very keen to listen to you, and I'm sure some of my students also are, and some of my colleagues. But it is up to you as to when you will conclude your lecture or say some more, because I've been listening keenly. I mean, I don't want you to. I mean, please. It is up to you. That is it.
Well, I'll say what I'll do if she does is say a little bit about. I'll say a little bit about the Australia's China anxiety.
Of course, please do. I would
now
very
and
much
then
like to.
And then we might go to questions, because
yes.
It seems to me that
this does not have a rigid time format, David.
Okay.
Yes.
That's all right. That's all right.
Okay.
So Australia has become, over the last 4 or 5 years in particular, very concerned about the rise of China, particularly China under Xi Jinping. And it is certainly the case that China has, I believe, behaved rather more aggressively in the world, more assertively in the world. And China has also imposed some really quite severe tariffs on Australian products, like Australian wine was being exported into China in very large quantities until a very, very severe tariff was imposed. Australian barley, Australian timber products, and other Australian exports suddenly faced very severe tariffs from China. So in the Australian case, there was a feeling that China had gone from being a very valuable trading partner. China is Australia's major trading partner. It had gone from being a very important trading partner to being a very assertive and perhaps unpredictable trading partner. And then more recently, an agreement was signed between China and the Solomon Islands, and this created a growing unease about China establishing a military base in the Pacific. So I would argue, again, as an historian, I would argue that in Australia, a lot of the anxiety about China is best understood, is best interpreted, is best read against the background of late 19th and early 20th century anxieties about Australia facing invasive Asia. What happens if this part of the world rises up and threatens Australia? Now, it seems to me that the likelihood of China wanting to invade Australia is almost zero. The likelihood of China wanting to assert itself in the region and in the world is much greater, but it's also, in a sense, understandable as an expression of growing Chinese economic power, that China is many, many times more significant economically as a nation than when Australia recognised China in 1972, that is 50 years ago. We are on the 50th anniversary of Australia's recognition of the People's Republic of China. So today, I think there is in some sections of the Australian population a revisiting of old anxieties about our vulnerability to the powerful nations to Australia's north. Of course, one consequence of this is that Australia is looking to diversify its trading relationships in the region, which is why India should expect more visits from Australian prime ministers, desperately hoping that India will buy more Australian products, because we need new economic relationships in the region, and we need other countries to buy our products so that we're not as dependent on China as we currently are. Almost 2/3 of our exports go to Asia, and about 40% of that total goes to China. So China is a very, very important economic partner to Australia, at the same time as it has emerged as more of a geopolitical threat to Australia. And that also means, in a way, that we're living in a much more tense, a much more geopolitically fraught world. We've just come through a recent election, and a lot of the talk was about national security. A lot of the talk was about defence and defence capability. A lot of the talk was about spending more money on defence, and so on and so on and so on. So that is one of the realities of our current thinking about Australia's vulnerability to Asia. Now, I might pause there and see if there are questions, and I'll also reach for a glass of water.
Well, David, can you hear me?
You become a little bit faint.
Okay, now can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, you are much more voluble.
Now, I thank you very, very much. We thank you on behalf of the department very, very much for your connections of fragility with cruelty, and all kinds of actions that can happen out of a sense of fragility and the many areas of Australia. We now, yes, and about the nation that is in appearance and that fears disappearance. And I thank you very much for that. We now open up the session for questions and answers, for questions which can be typed here in the chat box, or you can also, we are saying this to our listeners, to our students who are here at David, and many of them have joined us online as well, because not many have come. In fact, most of the students of our Australian Studies course, where we teach some of your writings, they are also at home. So they might type their question here, or they might also ask. That is up to them. But if you type it here, we can take up those questions.
The reading. You can do the reading, I presume, Mepshida, because I won't be able to read it.
Yes, I shall read the question.
Good.
So this is Ishita. She is our student, and she had taken up the Australian Studies course, which David is also designed in a code of colors.
Yes.
Yes.
I like the color-coded course.
Now, Ishita says, sir, as you have mentioned in the lecture and also in Australia's Asia, it can be seen that in terms of its geographical scope, Australia is slightly weighted in favor of China. Oh, the book is slightly weighted in favor of China, having 5 chapters on Chinese migration, 3 chapters on Indonesia, including Ruth Balance epilogue on North Australia and Eastern Indonesia, 2 on Japan, and 1 on India. The focus is very much on East Asia. I wanted to know how Australia perceives Southwest Asia. Now, Ishita, by that, do you mean the Indian subcontinent by Southwest Asia? Could you please clarify what do you mean by Southwest Asia? Oh, she means the Indian subcontinent. So,
Okay.
so what is?
Yes,
I wanted to know how Australia perceives Southwest Asia. So, in what tense, Ishita, past or present? Which tense do you? Anyway,
yes.
so David, this is the question.
Yes. Thank you very much for the question. I mean, the balance of that book was a matter of concern for us because we became aware in the course of putting the book together that there was an imbalance towards China. So, as one of the editors, I was actually recruited to the cause of writing a chapter on Japan so that we could have two chapters on Japan, which I think we absolutely needed the chapter on Japan, and I was happy to write it and interested in it. I think the one answer to the question goes to the reference that I made earlier about Alfred Deakin's response to India, remembering that Alfred Deakin was very interested in India, had visited India in the early 1890s, had written two books about India, Irrigated India and Temple and Tomb in India, both published in 1893. So his interest in India was considerable. It was also complex and uneasy in all sorts of ways. But if you go to that framing of India as the antique Orient, when Australia, in taking 1st of January 1901 as our starting point again, if you're looking towards the future that Australia faced, India was not featuring as strongly as the future as Japan, certainly, and as China, because both appeared to be geopolitically powerful and threatening in a way that India wasn't. And so paradoxically, perhaps, the parts of Asia that have become most prominent in Australian thinking are the parts of Asia from which Australians perceived the greatest threat, China and Japan. If you inhabit a part of Asia that was not seen to threaten Australia, you tended to miss out on our recognition, I'm very sorry to say. So India, I think, from the early 1900s, receded into a world of deep antiquity, of great religions, and so on, but it didn't figure as part of a burgeoning Asian modernity or the growing world of modern Asia. And it was not until much later, I think, that India re-emerged as part of Australia's thinking. As a corrective to Australia's Asia, I'd also want to point out that, and in defence of myself as a great scholar, that India actually does feature quite significantly in Stranded Nation, which looks at the ways in which Australia thought about Asia from the 1930s to the 1970s. And my argument there is that India was really critical in commenting directly and pointedly to Australia's exclusiveness on questions of race. So the racial exclusivity of Australia was something that Indian commentators, visitors, and diplomats commented upon. Now, diplomats are not supposed to comment on this kind of thing. They're supposed to be wonderfully discreet people who say nothing about anything much. But in 1953, I think it was, India sent General Cariappa to Australia as High Commissioner. a very famous military figure from Korg, a very British figure in a way, who spoke wonderful English, played cricket, was an expert polo player. So all the great accomplishments of British civilization were also very familiar to General Cariappa. He was a very fine ballroom dancer. So General Cariappa was in every respect, apart from the racial respect, an exemplary British gentleman. So General Cariappa was sent to Australia as India's High Commissioner, and he was here for about 3 years or so. And he made a statement that was critical of the White Australia policy, which diplomats are not really supposed to do. But the point that he made was that in every respect, someone like him and many other Indians who'd served in the armed forces and elsewhere were very familiar with British society, culture and values. They could fit in. There was no good reason why they couldn't become settlers, except, as he noted, the colour of their skin. So Cariappa made a very, very pointed reference to the racial basis of the White Australia policy, which Australian politicians of the time did their very best to avoid any reference to race. It was an economic policy. White Australia was, in their view, or in the official view, an economic policy, not a racial policy. Cariappa said it's a racial policy. So in Stranded Nation, the presence of India and the importance of India emerges really quite strongly as a nation, newly independent nation, that was critical of Australia's immigration policies and critical of Australia's self-representation, if you like. So while Australia's Asia, I think, was less attentive to India than it should have been, perhaps Stranded Nation addresses that imbalance by bringing India much more into the forefront of the discussion.
Now, David, do you think that Australia today had gone beyond, do you think that Australia today could go beyond this invasion perception or threat perception of Asia? Or there are possibilities beyond this threat perception in forming its Asia today? Because when we discuss Australia's Asia in the past, and when great historians like you focus on China and Japan and the threat perception that had arrived in reinforcing the emptiness of the alleged emptiness of that continent, are there other ways of looking? Do you think those ways are emerging today to look at Asia in other terms than this color threat or other kinds of threats? Or no, it is the same journey?
I don't think it's the same journey, although I don't think it is the same journey, but I think it has been, in a sense, we've been thrown back to some of the old anxieties by the rise of a more assertive China in the South China Seas, and some of the statements about Taiwan and so on. And clearly China's growing military power have kind of reinforced some of those old anxieties. So at a point where Australia was I think, emerging into a different understanding of the Asian world and a greater receptivity to the cultural diversity of that world and to those in Australia now who have come from Asia, and there is a large Indian population in Australia, a large Vietnamese population, considerable Sri Lankan population. a large Chinese population, of course, and that Australia was being reconfigured around the idea of a productive and inclusive diversity. So again, that debate about diversity and inclusion sits often uneasily alongside some of the older framings of threatening, and it's not so much threatening Asia now, it's very, very much threatening China. You know, it's China is at the front and centre. So Australia has quite good relations with Japan, and we have this entity, this body, this geopolitical creation called the Quad, which is India, Japan, India, Japan, the US, and Australia. So that's a kind of regional alliance which overlooks a lot of the cultural differences of those societies to find commonalities. So the commonalities with parts of Asia are becoming more apparent, but at the same time, geopolitical China is rather more of a threat, or is perceived to be such.
Right. Okay. Yes, David. And then there's one of our PhD candidates in the department who says that had Australia used the fear of Japanese invasion to affirm its identity as a nation?
Yes.
That's
a very interesting question, I think, because I think you can argue that both the fear of China in the first instance, I think, was important in trying to create among Australian colonists an idea of what united them. It's very hard now, looking back to the 19th century, to understand how different a lot of those colonists felt themselves to be. So if you're Scottish or Welsh or British or Irish, you can look back upon that now and say, well, they're all white settlers. But actually, each of those groups came from very different cultures, very different linguistic traditions, very different cultural traditions, a lot of profound differences in religion, the practice of religion. So that one of the things that if you're looking back to that period as an historian, you're not noticing necessarily the unity of those settlers, you're looking at their diversity. And one of the things that troubled late 19th century politicians was how are these diverse people from the British Isles going to be brought together as one nation? And I think in the first instance, it was the threat of China which helped sharpen that sense of their commonality. And one of the leading politicians of the 19th century, Sir Henry Parkes, coined the phrase when speaking about this issue of what held settler Australians together, coined the phrase the crimson thread of kinship. The crimson thread of kinship. In other words, blood and race was the thing that held you together. You might be Welsh, you might be Scottish, you might be Irish, you might be British, you might have different traditions linguistically and culturally, but the thing that holds you together is that. Or as a poet at the same time said, these were a people of one dear blood. A people of one dear blood. So the idea of the crimson thread of kinship and a people of one dear blood was sharpened and intensified by the references to China as a threat to Australian settlement. So if you could present China as the threat, then you could consolidate the notion that these colonists, for all their differences, had something profound and powerful in common, and the profound thing they had in common was a common racial identity.
Thank you, David. And one last question, where Devjani, another PhD candidate of the department, she says that she had come across an image in the world map which projects the entire world as a cat playing with a ball, and the ball is Australia. And is this graphic projection justified in the context of invasion? And is that limited to invasion alone? No,
yeah.
The ball, Australia is a ball that everybody covets. Now, what is there beyond invasion in that graphic image? Is what?
Oh yes. I'm very interested in maps actually, so I'm hoping that I might be sent that image. I'd love to see the image. I think it sounds fantastically interesting. And I'd love to see it. So could I please make a request to have that image forwarded to me? It's clearly a reference to the idea of the, if you like, the empty continent, I think, or the notion. Oh.
Please unmute. Please mute yourself. No, not to you, David. Please mute yourselves. All of us. I shall also mute myself. Yeah, maybe.
Right. I will not mute myself.
So, please disobey.
Yes. There is no point in being a mute speaker.
No. Please, David, carry on.
I will. I guess. I mean, I'm just I'm making this up as I go along, actually, because I'm not sure what the answer to the question might be. But it plays to the idea, or references the idea of Australia as an unformed continent. I think. You know, the idea that it's an incomplete creation.
Okay.
It might also refer to the idea of Australia as, you know, to some notions of its emptiness and its availability, because if you're playing with it in that way, you're playing with something that's in some ways both vulnerable and desirable. And of course, Australia's emptiness is now a kind of desire in a crowded world. Australia's emptiness and spaces is something that people can covet and value and appreciate. You can get away from people in Australia. And getting away from people is a very desirable condition often. But Australia is also a kind of wealthy continent in its resources. So while originally, in the late 19th, early 20th century, is often seen as being empty in the sense of having no worthwhile resources, we now know that beneath the ground, there are all sorts of resources that are coveted by the world, not least iron ore, less and less coal, of course, but also all those rare earths and rare metals that are necessary for your smartphones and electric vehicles and so on. So a lot of the resources that the world needs in order to become the wealthy place that it wants to be are found under the ground of Australia. So
right.
Australian resources are in. So Australian resources could be part of the cat playing, but also maybe there's a kind of notion of Australia as an unspoilt continent. You know, it's still a place where which I think is wrong. Australia has been very much spoilt environmentally, but often it's the Chinese students who I taught a lot often thought of Australia as being unspoiled. You know, there'd been virtually no human footprint on the Australian continent, so it was one of the last unspoiled continents on Earth. I really don't know the answer to the question, but I'd love to see the image.
Thank you, David. And I think Munjima, when you asked, and I would request Debjani to please send Professor David Walker that image, because he had undertaken once a project on Australian map making, isn't it, David?
Yes.
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 And yeah, so if you
and it would be generously acknowledged.
Now, oh, and then Monjima is asking something for which I think, Monjima, you could read Australia's Asia, how Australia's geographic proximity to Asia influenced its cultural identity as a nation. Now, I think this is what many of his books are about.
Yes.
Yes, so you have to go to them, I would say, particularly Australia's Asia. The introduction to it responds to this question
yes,
intensely,
yes,
engages with it.
Yes.
So, David, could I also see Karen for a moment? Because
I could summons her. She is not in the room at the moment.
No. Then you please do not need to. Please do not do so. So here we and give her my regards and love. Now
certainly,
here
yes.
we come. Yeah. Yes. Now here we come almost to the end of the session. I would now request my senior colleague in the department and who had set some of the pioneering practices in the department, our colleague Professor Gautam Buddha Shural, who had not only authored important books and edited some, but he is also a wonderful classroom teacher. And yes, indeed. And sir, I would invite you, our dear professor and senior colleague, to please give the vote of thanks. And how can I thank you, David, in a way that will make you not laugh at me? So thank you on behalf of all of us. Over to Professor Gautam Buddha Shural.
So, a very good afternoon, sir.
Thank you.
Sir, before going for the formal Thanksgiving, I have not a question, because I have no knowledge about Australian literature, its history, nothing absolutely. But from your talk today, which was very interesting and very engaging, you mentioned while talking about the multifacetedness of the term emptiness.
Yes.
You talked about a kind of a spiritual crisis. Emptiness also denotes a kind of a spiritual crisis or psychological crisis. You were talking about that, and as far as the time frame was concerned, it was late 19th century, right? So actually, can that be a place, that kind of a spiritual crisis, can that be in any way linked to the contemporary British scenario? Because by that time, industrialization was on, and books like Darwin's one, they were coming out, and they were delivering a great blow to the bedrocks of Christianity. So there was a spiritual crisis there also. Can it be contextualized from that angle, or is it peculiar to Australia only?
That's a terrific question. I think it can be related to those questions of the disappearing certitudes of the 19th century, which relate to religion, relate to questions, as you mentioned, of Darwin and Darwinian theories, the place of human beings in the world, the notion of the evolutionary status of the human race rather than its spiritual standing and so on. I think all of these played a role, and certainly in the life of Alfred Deakin, who was one of our very early prime ministers. He was very keen on finding new religion. So he was attracted for a time to theosophy, and one of his attractions to India was actually to try and discover spiritual roots or traditions that would sort of fortify the modern human being. But But of course, one of his religions was also the religion of the British Raj and the religion of efficiency and the religion of scientific capacity. But another answer to your question, I think, and it's a thought that is prompted in a sense by the question, or at least relates to the question, is that I think this sense of Australia's emptiness was also the impetus for Australia to try and create a literature of its own, a literature that spoke to its particular condition, to the condition of settler Australia and to the nature of the continent itself. So there was a growing emphasis from the 1890s on Australia developing both a literature and an art that spoke to the nature of the continent. So I think that was, again, an attempt to replace a derivative culture with something that was more indigenous, if you like, or at least settler indigenous, that's something that grew out of the life experience of settler Australians, of their particular conditions, their circumstances, their social life, and the peculiarities of the continent they inhabited. So, and there was a very interesting, in about 1907, getting back to maps, there was a map which appeared in a publication, a monthly publication in Australia, which mapped all the parts of Australia that had had a novel written about them. This is a very interesting kind of colonising project, really, because you're replacing Aboriginal Australia, because Aboriginal Australia had named the continent, of course. So in a sense, you're replacing Aboriginal naming with a kind of literary cultural naming for those parts of Australia which had been, if you like, colonised by the novelist. So that attempt to fill in the empty spaces of Australia with literary expression, I think also goes to the point that you're raising, that somehow you had to fill that space with something, and the something was, as I say, the novel, was art, but was also speech and language. How did Australians speak? What manner of people were they? How were they to be characterised and categorised, and so on? So all of those questions around what you might think of as a national identity or something distinctive came to the fore in the 1890s and were among the driving forces for an attempt to restate the nation or reimagine the nation in literary cultural terms.
So thank you so much, sir. Formally we come to the end of the session, and on behalf of the department, definitely we all offer you a huge thanks. I offer you a huge thanks for today's beautiful session, a wonderful session. It's so very engaging, and for a person like me, personally, I'm indebted to you for this kind of an enlightening talk. I thank our Honorable Vice Chancellor, possibly for some engagement. He could not actually appear today on the platform. I also thank the Registrar of the Department of the University for making us, for helping us with all these technical support. And I thank the entire university community, especially our colleagues within and outside the department. And of course, we must thank the people in the canteen, because usually what Ipshita does, whenever she organizes such a talk, she offers the students a bite.
Very good idea.
So this time also she entertained everybody with chicken pakora and tea. So that was something for which the canteen people needs to be thanked. And I think above everyone else, I think the students who showed their enthusiasm, the researchers who equally showed their enthusiasm for today's lecture. I thank them on behalf of the department. So again, I thank you, sir, for today's brilliant session. And yes, definitely. I do not know how is it going to be possible, but we invite you to come to India. And definitely, I thank at the end, but this is a huge thank again to Ipshita also for making this happen, right?
Yes.
So thank you, sir. Thank you. Now I hand over the microphone to Ipshita to declare the session formally closed.
Sir, you have declared it closed. That is enough. I just wanted to say, David, that next time before you go to Shanghai, you must come here at a conference and chat with our students so that you have many Australian studies people here as well. Come on, we must meet you in India. Please, you and Karen.
I would love to do that. I mean, I have travelled to India on a number of occasions, and except that was then taken over by aggressive China, of course. So I had to go to China a lot. But I've thoroughly enjoyed my trips to India, and would love to go again. Although I'm getting very old now, and but India was a marvelous experience, and I very much enjoyed it. And
come again.
I also have a very high opinion of the practice of Australian studies in India, because some of the best, most articulate, most thoughtful people, and you are included in that group, of course, Ipshita, are among my Indian friends and colleagues. And please pass on my best wishes to your Vice-Chancellor, who is also a great friend of Australian studies.
I expected, he said he would be here, maybe because I could not give him a call right before, but he was he wanted to be here, and there was a crucial meeting going on, I think.
Sure. No, that's okay. No, I quite understand that. That's fine. But pass on my best wishes.
Yes. I now request Professor Gautam Buddha Shural to declare the session over.
Yes. Okay, sir. With your permission, we declare the session over. And again, a huge thanks from the department.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. So we are leaving.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everyone.
Okay. Okay, then. So I'm ending the call.